Finally, we see this with the topic of truth as well. If there isn't an absolute truth, like rape or murder always being wrong, then everything is just an opinion.
Yes, welcome to reality. Everything is just an opinion, especially when it comes to morals. You talk about absolute truth. That's not how I would describe absolute truth, being these subjective moral statements, right? I would say like absolute truth, like this overarching absolute truth that exists in reality. I think that could be described better as, that it's absolutely true whether or not an asteroid, went this way or that way. Or it's an absolute truth whether or not an asteroid struck our planet. I would say that those things would be absolute truths. And those absolute kinds of truths exist. But here's the asterisk. I don't think that we'll ever actually know the full absolute truth. Due to how we experience reality, even if we sat there and we saw somebody cause an ocean liner to disappear, or a burning bush, or anything else that seems fantastical to us now, I don't think that we can trust our senses to give us reliable information to determine that that is some kind of magical thing that happened. Or the absolute truth is, a bush was burning and was not actually burning, or a flood on this entire earth actually happened. I feel like science is geared towards revealing this absolute truth the best that it can. And we have to constantly tweak science and math in order to further reveal this absolute truth. But due to our human experience, we will never know what this absolute truth of reality is. Now, going back to your whole moral description of the absolute truth, morality is very subjective, and I've done plenty of arguments on this channel against the general argument from morality for God. But for your instance here, I would not say that either of those things are absolutely wrong, at least not the way that we perceive them, because the way that we perceive them typically tends to vary throughout time and whatever location on this planet, whatever civilization that you're in. Because what we would consider graping somebody now would not have been considered graping somebody back then. Or the grape itself wouldn't have been seen as wrong or bad. The same thing goes with murder. There are definitely times in the Bible where murder is seen as fine. Typically, Christians think that part of the Ten Commandments is to not kill, but that's not really it. It says don't murder, meaning don't murder your fellow Israelite or your fellow person in your society, because typically in good societies, or at least societies that tend to survive, murdering your fellow person shouldn't be allowed, because that's not a way for a society to thrive. So the things that you're talking about here, the graping and the murdering and all this stuff, those are societal norms that have developed over thousands of years. These are not absolute moral truths, because I don't think absolute moral truths exist.
A debate about right and wrong would be as trite as a debate over the best flavor of ice cream.
Well, I mean, I feel like debating these moral truths is just like debating whether or not vanilla ice cream is good or strawberry ice cream is good. They're not exactly that comparable, because obviously the moral truths have more of an impact on us as a society or us as individuals than like ice cream goes. So it's not a great analogy by any means. But as far as like a moral statement being an opinion, it is exactly like having the opinion that vanilla is better than strawberry. One group over here says that it's fine to marry somebody whether they're the same gender or same sex or anything like that. Another group thinks that you should burn in hell for all eternity just for going down on a motherfucker. You understand how this just seems like different opinions here. Even within Christianity, the moral foundation has changed over time. When Christianity first started out, slavery was seen as perfectly fine. It was even in the Old Testament indicated by God that it was okay to take slaves from foreign nations. Now, you couldn't enslave your fellow Israelite or your fellow Hebrew or your fellow Jew, but there were certain situations where your fellow Jew could become your slave, and you didn't even have to give that slave up after the appointed amount of time. Regardless of all of those nuances, it's still a fact that in the Old Testament, God looked favorably upon slavery, at least favorably enough that he did not command that it not exist or not happen, and he laid down rules in order for the Israelites to take slaves. So he at least looked favorably enough on slavery to indicate those things. But now, of course, we find slavery to be abhorrent. We cannot fathom thinking that somebody is good for indicating that slavery is fine. So why would you think that your God, who indicated that slavery was just fine, how could you think that that God was good and is the thing that gives reality its underlying uniformity? All indications that I've mentioned here seem to show that God is a shitty, genocidal dictator type of thing, and that it definitely does not give a shit about the uniformity in nature. All it cares about is introducing variability into our reality, and thereby making science unusable in this reality if that God were to exist. Because if that God does exist and he only seeks to introduce variability into our reality, then there's no way that we could do science, at least not reliably. At any point in time, God could decide to fuck around with the rules of reality, and our science experiments would not render the same results every time. So you're going to have to do a little bit better job in connecting God to this underlying truth of reality or underlying uniformity of reality. You're going to have to do a much better job of connecting those two ideas.
Because math is consistent, because experiments are repeatable, and because we know there's absolute truth, we know there is a God.
No, you don't, because God is completely separated from all of those things. Whether or not a God exists, morals would still exist. We would still have moral opinions on things if God were not to exist. The only thing that changes is that Christians wouldn't be able to think, oh, well, this book tells me how I should act, so therefore that's how everybody should act. That's the difference. You are confronted with the fact that you have to develop your own sense of morality. As for science and math goes, I don't see how God is connected to those either. He's definitely not connected to this underlying uniformity in nature, because as I've already pointed out this entire video, he only seeks to introduce variability into nature. Math is a description of the reality that we're presented with. Science is a description of the reality that we're presented with. If those realities were different in whatever way, then our math and our science would adapt in order to better represent our reality. All in all, I give this video a 1 beaker out of 5. And that's because it's somewhat well produced. Definitely great voice work by John here. I do appreciate him attempting to provide some kind of mathematical or scientific argument for God. But the entire video falls flat on its face because John fails to provide us with any kind of clear indication that God is necessary for the uniformity in nature. He just arbitrarily states that God is, in some kind of ad hoc fashion, just stating that God is necessary. John continues to introduce problems into his argument when he refuses to acknowledge that math and science and morals are all things that are dictated by a human mind, not by God. Math was created by humans to describe reality, science was made in much the same way, and morals are just something that have always existed, regardless of whether or not it's a human mind or some other animal mind. God is not necessary for any of them, and I just did not see any argument that connects God to the uniformity in nature or even to morality.